Today we're going to speak of the concept of focus with awareness. Notice how I stated focus with awareness. This came as an idea upon reflections of a while back. I listened to the audiobook of The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. And I never understood what the concept was regarding alchemy or the alchemist. And when I came across that book, I was introduced into the philosophy, the way of life. Now, what ended up happening was I went into research to go into the foundations of the concept of mental alchemy, which is rearranging the mind and having the mind reflect to rearrange reality. In other words, bringing forth a vision. So when you say rearrange the mind, we've been talking about it from the perspective of concept of self and embodiment of the concept of self, and then the reflection of it, which is the success. The concept of alchemy is the medieval forerunner of chemistry, based on the supposed transformation of matter. It was concerned particularly with attempts to convert base metals into gold or to find a universal elixir. Now, the powerful thing about this concept of alchemy, what would seem as a repetitive task and a high level of self-discipline and focus, to be able to sit there with one thing and test and integrate and go into different bodies of work and figure out how you can adapt and adopt the different principles and the elements of matter to produce a result, would have a very powerful side effect. A person would become more aware of who they are. They would become more conscious. As I like to say, they would raise their awareness. Their awareness would go up. Now, this poses to be very powerful for us, so we're going to talk about awareness and focus, because many of us are aware of the goals that we have, the visions that we have, the definite chief aims, that which we desire to see brought forth. And in the initial stages of this journey, we also are aware of what we need to do or what we don't need to do. So we have some level of awareness. Now, the next phase in the journey is what I call commitment, or being loyal to that vision, and to stay committed to bringing forth that vision no matter what happens on the day-to-day journey. And as a result of staying committed, something interesting happens. We develop our own philosophy, our own ways of looking at reality. And a lot of times we share these philosophies with others. And others can benefit from our philosophy because they integrate components of our philosophy, and it helps them with their visions and their goals. It's one of the most rewarding things in life to be able to learn something from experience and then share it with another person so they too can produce a result or success in their life. This creates what we call inward wisdom, which is a result of knowledge, perhaps borrowing different information from different bodies of work or conversations from others, books, and so forth, and applying it, gathering experience. It is from this combination, what we have as a result of that is newfound wisdom. And with this wisdom, we have a higher degree of clarity. We understand how things work. And we feel a higher degree of self-confidence and self-esteem. Thus, it's important to stay committed on our vision, to find the joy in that, and to repeat this process again, and again. Now, one of the things that happened last year as a result of the circumstances and the place that I was staying in going into lockdown is I moved closer to a mountain, a well-known resort/ski area in Ontario, Canada. And I decided to stay there because I wanted to take up snowboarding. And I never did it before. Now, I did some board sports when I was growing up, and I started to get into board sports again, rekindling my passion and joy for board sports. And there's many different board sports. We've got surfing, wakeboarding, skateboarding, longboarding. We've got snowboarding. We've got many different kinds of board sports, and they've always been fascinating to me because it integrates mind and body through balance, coordination, connection, and flow. So I took up the hobby, and I started once again as a beginner. And the same rules that allowed me to develop proficiency in the various skills of my life were applied again to the process of learning how to snowboard. Now, we're going to use this as an example as we weave through this discussion, but it's important to recognize that you could apply this to any area of your life when it comes to bringing forth success. Now, James Allen said it really well in one of his books, The Heavenly Life. He says, "A speculative philosophy will prove a shadowy thing in the time of calamity. A man must have the inward wisdom which puts an end to grief." Now, this is extremely powerful because if we encounter different circumstances in our life in which we feel we don't have control over those circumstances, we can go back to the foundations of what brings us back into flow or ideal states of mind. And we could stay committed on the journey by valuing the different parts on the journey. Now, the snowboarding was an additional hobby. I still applied the same philosophy to the different projects that I'm involved with nowadays in the entrepreneurial space. So before we get into discussion about the process of raising awareness, which is what we want, let's distinguish and then integrate when we talk about focus and awareness. So the textbook definition of focus is the center of interest or activity. So you have an interest, you have a desire, you have something that you want to cultivate, a skill, or a vision you want to see brought forth. So we develop focus. Also, the state or quality of having or producing clear visual definition. Imagining, seeing it in our mind's eye as what we desire to see brought forth in this world, which is what we've been discussing a lot through our Neville Goddard-based discussions. And we also have awareness, which textbook definition, knowledge or perception of a situation or fact. So when we have reference experience in our life and we say, I understand how something works now because I was able to bring forth that success, or I was able to understand something as a result of practice experience, then we have what we call fact. And we have a higher degree of awareness. We understand how things work. And we also understand ourselves better. Also, awareness is the state of being conscious of something. More specifically, it is the ability to direct, know, and perceive, to feel, or to be cognizant of events. When we have a higher degree of wisdom towards a particular area of success in our lives, we notice that we understand how it works very deeply. And if for whatever the reason may be, we have not developed a certain degree of communication skills, we may find it challenging to communicate it to another person. So thus, if we want to communicate it to another person, we develop a higher degree of communication skills. For example, when I had transitioned out of my IT business, I made a commitment to myself that I was going to go out also, as part of the other things that I do, teach entrepreneurship to those that are starting out in business. And because I had the reference experience and the success, I felt that I could go out and teach it to other people and replicate the success. So when they show up with their business model, and then I would see what the thing was that they needed to do, I would make a proposition to them. I'd say, what I recommend you do is reach out to these prospects and make an offer, or start a Facebook ad campaign because it looks like the majority of your audience is on Facebook. Or go ahead and start a YouTube channel and speak about this subject in a way that relates with the existing conversation that is happening on YouTube, because many are already speaking about this subject. And what I would notice is they would come back to me maybe a few weeks later and they wouldn't do it. Now, during those days, I would get very frustrated and wouldn't understand why they wouldn't do those things that they even know they have to do to produce success. So this required me to go within myself and develop a higher degree of consulting or coaching skills so that I could then translate communication over to behavioral change or transformational change. In other words, some way, somehow, through our communication, they would actually do those things and produce the results. Now, this brought more conscious awareness onto the fact that much of what we reveal on our journey is a result of our subconscious. And after going into the studies and deep integration of the subconscious concepts, I then realized that people were starting to get results because they were changing. So rather than focusing on the tactical stuff of what they should do, they already knew they had to do those things a lot of the times. I started to focus more on the subconscious self-image aspects of who they believe themselves to be. Now, this happened as a result of raising awareness. So the concept of focus and awareness is to pick a goal. I want X result, or I want to see a person on my team produce a result, or I want to help a client produce a result. And through the process of cause and effect reflection, cause within our consciousness and the effect experience with the other person, we have the ability to understand by not getting frustrated, but saying, what can I do about this? There must be a way. There has to be a way. Just that idea of there must be a way, there has to be a way, there is a possibility, starts to open up the doors to reveal how it works. And then we become more aware. So another way of looking at it is awareness is the state of being conscious of something. More specifically, it is the ability to direct, know, and perceive, to feel, or to be cognizant of events. Concern and well-informed interest in a particular situation or development. So these are the things that we want to develop: focus and awareness. Now, focus is essentially saying, I have a goal, I have a vision, I have a definite chief aim. Specificity. And awareness is saying all that shows up within the scope of what I am experiencing is in harmony and in contribution to the vision. It is that level of presence that allowed the alchemists to be able to bring forth a lot of contributions to chemistry, sciences, as well as philosophy, and which is one of the main reasons why I'm very fascinated on the concept of mental alchemy, which again is rearranging the mind to reflect as rearrangement and reality. Now, we go through generally these 4 stages when it comes to raising awareness on a particular subject, a certain skill, and so forth. Now, I'm going to tie this back to my experience of learning snowboarding. And the beginning phase usually is what we call unconscious incompetence. The individual does not understand or know how to do something and does not necessarily recognize the deficit. They may even deny the usefulness of the skill. The individual must recognize their own incompetence and the value of the new skill before moving on to the next stage. The length of time an individual spends in this stage depends on the strength of the stimulus to learn. So, we can apply this to a skill, or we can apply this to staying committed towards a vision. A lot of times in the beginning, we don't know how it's going to happen. And there's nothing wrong with that because that's usually the starting phase. So in my snowboarding example, I was observing 8-year-olds and 12-year-olds flying off the ramps and whatever else, and I'm looking at that, and they're flying down the hills, and I'm thinking to myself, gosh, how am I going to be able to do that? That seems like an impossibility. Maybe I'll just get to a certain level of proficiency. And then I caught myself saying that, and I said, wait a second. I'm already creating certain limitations in my mind. What if I could just follow the process that I've been always following, which is practice, dedicate 2 hours every day on the skill, show up at the slopes at a certain time, practice the skill, practice for 2 hours, and then at the end of the night, I can watch a handful of YouTube videos. There's many great videos on YouTube, and I'll put some links in the description for those of you interested in snowboarding, that talk about the various things that you would do. But if I had consumed that information for 2 hours instead of practicing for 2 hours, I know something about myself. I would get too stuck in my head, and I would not take the actions required to produce the results. This is about ratios. And each person has different amounts of ratios. So I'm sharing with you the ratio that works for me, which is 80% practice, applying, doing, and upon reflection, at the end of the day, viewing some content, reading some books, and so forth, applicable to the skill, to reflect upon my experience and further evolve it via knowledge. And then I know the next day what I need to practice. When you try something, you'll see. For example, in snowboarding, you maybe do the first run and you see how much you don't know yet. So then we become conscious of our incompetence, which is the next stage. Though the individual does not understand or how to do something, they recognize the deficit as well as the value of a new skill in addressing the deficit. The making of mistakes can be integral to the learning process at this stage. So we recognize, we don't shame ourselves or blame anyone else. We recognize that we don't have the skill yet. And we become more conscious on the incompetence of the skill yet. And a lot of times we might associate the word incompetence with, I'm not good enough, I'll never be good enough, this other person's a lot better than me, I don't have the power, and so forth. Those are not helpful associations to the word incompetence in this context. We're speaking about it from a real understanding of the progression and the commitment. The next is conscious competence. The individual understands or knows how to do something. So once we recognize, so the snowboarding example would be, I go to the hill, I go on the same slope, and I practice a couple things, maybe carving side to side. And my goal is to just make it down the hill without falling, and to repeat that again and again and again for 2 hours, the same hill. No going off jumps or trying to do anything else, sticking with the same thing again and again and again. Now, in past situations in my life, I thought this was boring, repetitively doing the same thing, until I realized that I was finding a deeper ability to understand a lot of nuances in what I was doing and relating it to other areas of my life. For example, the very act of starting over again allowed me to generate ideas for my content. A lot of the conversations that we've been having over the last months have been a result of reflections. You can even go back to those discussions and see. On my putting 2 and 2 together from starting from scratch at a level of unconscious incompetence, moving into conscious incompetence, and then moving into conscious competence on particular moves or maneuvers. Now, the same is to be said about business building. Perhaps in the beginning, a person doesn't understand marketing, selling, operations, and leadership. And it can seem very overwhelming. I remember back in the days, it was 2004 or 5, and I was starting to dabble in entrepreneurship. And off an internet forum, I met this guy who was running a successful side part-time internet-based business. And when we would get on conversations on the phone, it felt like he was speaking a totally different language. he was at a totally different level of understanding, or specifically put, his awareness was so high on the level of elements and the different aspects of business building that at that time I was thinking to myself, gosh, how am I going to catch up to his level? Now, fast forward, I understand clearly what he was saying now. But that's because I've been on this journey since then, and actually full-time since 2009. But I've been on the journey long enough that I recognize the different elements that show up on the journey in entrepreneurship. And it's usually the same stuff over and over again, and you continuously get better at it. Now, through recognizing that this is the progression, this is what happens. We stay committed to something. We actually find joy knowing that we're going to get to the destination in the moment. Everything that we're doing is in contribution. So looking at those 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds flying down the hill on the black diamonds, the higher level of hills, I'm thinking to myself, now it seems possible. Actually, I went down a black diamond this year, and I never even thought that I was going to go on a black diamond this year, but I also recognized in the moment that when I had that idea, that was a limiting potentiality that I was creating. And I could look at it at how it really is through a progression. That's why I'm sharing this with you. So what ends up happening is you get a conscious competence on that aspect of, let's say, your business. Maybe you become a little bit more competent in your marketing, your productivity, your sales, your communication, understanding elements that exist within your subconscious and changing it. And then you show up again day to day and you practice it and you find joy in it, because that is how you develop a higher degree of wisdom, knowledge plus experience. The individual understands or knows how to do something. However, demonstrating the skill or knowledge requires concentration. It may be broken down into steps, and there is a heavy conscious involvement in executing the new skill. So in the beginning, it feels like you've got to apply more conscious focus. And what we want is to become subconsciously competent at it, or unconsciously competent at it, which is the next phase. The individual has so much practice with the skill that it has become second nature and can be performed easily. As a result, the skill can be performed while executing another task. The individual may be able to teach it to others depending on how and when it was learned. And also, I would add, from my experience from going into consulting in 2013, was the recognition that I needed to develop a higher degree of learning and teaching ability, transformational skills, and to be able to help others to understand where they are in the journey and relate it to their paradigm, their belief systems, and so forth. Because I recognized that in a way I was, in the beginning, when I moved into consulting, I seemed to be more adamant about my belief system. All you got to do, I would say, is just call the prospects. But I didn't recognize that my belief system was that rejection in prospecting is not a form of I am not good enough. It is a matter of optimization data and the recognition that each rejection is moving me forward towards my vision. But they don't have that subconscious paradigm yet. So they were seeing it from the perspective of, I don't want to deal with rejection, because subconsciously they're thinking that each time they get rejected, that they're not good enough. And we've been talking about this in our videos. We are divine perfection. We are ideal already. We realize this more so each day. And this is the way we recognize it, by raising our awareness. So recognize that we could potentially go through these stages, and depending on the skill and aspects of the skill. So going back to the snowboarding example, it was a period of time before I felt so competent, starting on the green hills and going on the blue hills, and then eventually starting to go off the jumps and perfecting my carving and slides and all the other things. Again, if you want to know about snowboarding, I'll put a link to the channel that I learned from. It was very helpful. But all I did was just repeat every day when I would go on the slopes, 5 days a week, because I'm living pretty close to the slopes. Practice 1 hour to 2 hours a day. And I would commit to practicing certain maneuvers, certain skills for that entire time that I was there, knowing that if I got my foundations really good, I could progress onto the next level. And I would find joy in it. This would develop a higher degree of focus. This reminds me, and that's why I integrated in here, of a book called The One Thing by Gary Keller. And the idea, the premise of this book is to stay committed, to stay focused on one task or one project or one vision all the way to completion. Because as a result of it, you would understand yourself. You would learn how to learn. Learning is a very important thing. You learn a skill. But you also learn how to learn when you develop a skill, and then you develop another skill, and another skill, and another skill, and so forth. Some of you might remember that a few times I've referenced something called the format learning model. And this model helps us learn better. So we mentioned there was 4 aspects to it. Why, what, how, and what if. And many of us tend to bias towards one or another. So for example, a why learner always wants to know why things are the way they are. But maybe they don't practice it enough. They don't develop the how, or they're not interested in the how, or the what if, as in where to apply, not just in the way it was presented, but in different areas of their life. So they don't get necessarily a lot of wisdom. And this can result in repeating things to people, but not actually transforming the other person. The next would be the what, the theoretical breakdown. So this is the theory. Like when I talk about unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious competence, we're talking about theoretical breakdowns of something that we could use as a framework to produce results or bring forth success. Now that's what? That's theory. Then we got how to apply. So we're going to talk about how to apply now. And then we got where else can we apply? What if? If a person can become more integral with these 4 elements in becoming proficient at a skill, they would develop a higher degree of focus, and they would expand, or as I like to say, raise their awareness. Because the way I like to look at it is we are constantly raising our awareness. We are becoming more conscious of how we operate, how reality works, and how we relate to our vision and reality. Now, Gary Keller, in his book, The One Thing, says it really well. 4 things, actually, to help us become more focused. And we're going to relate it back to entrepreneurship, my earlier consulting experience, as well as we're going to relate it back to my snowboarding, multidimensional perspective. Success is about doing the right thing, not about doing everything right. So as mentioned, in my snowboarding example, I didn't need to try to do all the maneuvers that I saw everyone doing on the slopes. All I had to do was learn the foundations and practice that until I got to a certain level of proficiency at it, and then progress and find joy doing it. So that way I wouldn't get frustrated saying, I'm not good enough, or I'm not going to hit the black diamonds. What I actually found is that I actually went on the black diamond, and I was totally fine on the black diamond because I followed this progression. But if I didn't, I would have been frustrated with the learning, and I would have also not embraced the learning experiences from the falls, and I fell quite a bit. And so each of those things were in contribution and harmony to my vision. But I focused on doing the one move again and again and again. Now, the same is to be said about entrepreneurship. You try things in the marketplace, and perhaps it doesn't work. You go back to the office or reflection time, and you say, what did I learn, and how can I do it better next time? And is there some resources or information that I can pull knowledge from or wisdom from? I mean, there's tons of videos on YouTube that I could take, integrate, test again, and repeat the process again and again and again till I perfect this one move. Perhaps it's a certain ad platform. Perhaps it's a certain platform on social media. I know many that have built successful businesses just with Instagram, just with YouTube, just with search engine optimization, just with certain social media platforms. And not just even the social media platforms, but the aspects within the social media platforms. For example, I know many that have built successful businesses with just a Facebook group or just a Facebook page, which is an element related to Facebook as a whole. He also says the trick to success is to choose the right habit and bring just enough discipline to establish it. That's it. Let's use the example of consulting. Perhaps you recognize that when you go into your consulting sessions or when you're mentoring somebody, that you find yourself getting frustrated, as I did, when they're not producing results or implementing what you had suggested. You then recognize that this interpretation isn't helping the dynamic, and it's better to be lighthearted and understanding. So then you go back and you start to read about different ways that you can handle difficult conversations. Or if a person is not producing result, what does that mean? And what kind of teaching skills or mentoring skills can I develop to become better at it? So then you pick that, and then you gauge it every time you go into your interactions with your clients. You know you're getting better when perhaps they didn't complete the task, that you're not getting frustrated about it, but you're saying, I understand, let's figure out what this means together. And you have more of a mindful response. Third, when you do the right thing, it can liberate you from having to monitor everything. So this is a very powerful thing. Let's go back to the snowboarding example. What I learned is that after I got very proficient at certain elements of snowboarding, is that the balance, coordination, and a lot of things when you started to go on the more advanced slopes and going off the jumps were like second nature. I had then become unconscious in my competence in those abilities, second nature. My body would automatically move. I would be automatically engaged, and I wouldn't have to overthink specifically, and I would just be able to complete the maneuver. Now, this was very rewarding for me, not just because I wanted to learn the skill and get better at it, and I'm planning to next season go back again, but also be able to relate this in this conversation, a real practical, real-life experience, example to share with you. And then it also validates the next point. Build one habit at a time. One habit at a time. Now, this is true, for example, in the entrepreneurial space. You have a business and you say, I'm going to create this. And perhaps the insight might be, my goal is to connect with people that could provide me funding or that could buy my product or service. That's a skill in itself. We call that consultative selling, which is discussed extensively in the book Spin Selling by Neil Rackham. I recommend reading it if you want to develop in your ability to sell consultatively. I also talk about that in my entrepreneurial program, if you're a student of that. Now, building this habit requires the following. Practicing it, ideally every day, being involved in as many conversations, making offers, as well as reflecting at the end of the day or at some point during the week on how you could improve in it. And what I like to do, as mentioned, 80% practice. So that means 80% of the time is invested in conversations, communications, selling. And 20% of my time in developing the skill is watching the YouTube videos or reading the books or consulting with a mentor or hiring a consultant and so forth to help me optimize. It is through this process over the years that I developed many skills, and it's the process that I teach over and over again in not only these videos, but in any kind of engagement where I'm involving myself as a teacher, consultant, or instructor. Now, I'm also a big fan of imagination, and I want to relate back to, and rather than making this a very lengthy discussion on the topic of imagination, I want to relate back to a video discussion that I did on George Schubel's book, How to Make Our Mental Pictures Come True, which you're going to get a lot of benefit from if you integrate what was discussed in that video as complementary to this particular conversation here. So let's discuss this, and so we could lightly talk about how we could integrate imagination, because we've been talking a lot about practice here, and we can also benefit from working with imagination. So in my own reference experiences in those three areas, consulting, snowboarding, as well as entrepreneurship, I would imagine regularly, ideally at the end of the night, of how I ideally would have done the maneuvers in snowboarding, or ideally have had the conversations with the clients, or ideally have produced success in the business. And these kinds of imaginal activities at the end of the night were enormously powerful because they have the ability to impress the subconscious mind, so that what happens is the next day you're noticing that you interact with those elements differently. So that's how I work with imagination. I simply look at the different experiences that I had each day, and I change how I relate to them in my imagination by imagining them to have gone differently, as well as imagining how I could see myself moving to the next level of progression. I remember when I first imagined that I was going to go down the Black Diamond. It was actually when I was going up the chairlift. And interestingly enough, it was the end of the night, and they actually roped off the area for the blue and the green. And I was thinking to myself as I was going up, as I'm looking at the Black Diamond and its level of steepness, and I'm thinking, you know what? I think I could probably do that, but let me just scope it out and see how it is so I could figure out a nice pathway to go down. And what was interesting was when I got up to the top, they roped it off. So you could say my subconscious mind had brought forth that experience, so I had no choice but to go down the Black Diamond. And I did. I went down, and I went back up again and went down again and up again and went down again. And I remember visualizing in the chairlift going up, seeing myself going down, and it became a reality. He says we must be familiar by means of outward observation and experience with the things which relate themselves to our inner picture. If our thoughts of $5,000 is a vague one, we're using the example of bringing forth money, then before we try to see it clearly in the mind, we must go to the bank and ask the teller to show us 5 $1,000 bills or 50 100 bills, which we study carefully. And in this way, we get more light upon the money. We are able to see it mentally more clearly. So the premise of his process was essentially, if at the end of the night you have a hard time imagining how you want to see your life to be, to actually go and visit the places or experience those elements so that you would have reference experience and the feeling of that moment to be able to work with in your imagination. For example, he says here, so with the business enterprise, if it is an automobile business we have in mind, we visit an automobile factory and observe the method of building an automobile. So same is to be said if you want to have a car. Go and try out the different cars that you're fascinated by and actually get a feel for them. So it's interesting how much we can work with imagination, and to further stimulate the imagination, reference experience becomes very powerful. So as mentioned, in the snowboarding, on the entrepreneurial journey, or in the consulting journey, you have a lot of experience, so it's easier to work with it in your imagination at the end of the night. And even, as he says here, so with the home. We visit the homes of our friends, we become acquainted with the various kinds of architecture, the kind of bricks and timber, the arrangement of rooms, and every other detail which will help to throw light upon the thought of the home which we are contemplating now. So in grand summary, the way we level up our awareness, raise our awareness, is recognize that we could be in different stages of our journey about the element or the entire vision. Unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and unconscious incompetence, which is usually what we all want with a skill or whatever ability we want to have, which is, you could look at it from a general perspective, bringing forth success. But these are different stages of the journey, and it's okay to be in either one of these stages of the journey. And if we value the different stages in the journey, we'll be more lighthearted with the day-to-day when it comes to bringing forth success. The other thing is the recognition of focus plus awareness. So imagination allows us to expand our awareness, working with our imagination. Our awareness is also expanded by seeing things all the way to completion, as discussed in The One Thing by Gary Keller. And through the combination of working with this together, we understand what James Allen says when he says, a speculative philosophy will prove a shadowy thing in the time of calamity. A man must have the inward wisdom which puts an end to grief. So we learn about ourselves, we learn how to learn, and we value having a goal and a vision plus the journey to the realization of the vision, because internally, through the process, like the alchemist, who attempts to sit there and turn lead into gold or find the universal elixir, we find our ideal philosophy, and we remain consistent on that philosophy. We become unwavering and lighthearted about our belief system. And this belief system carries us through the journey of bringing forth success again, again, and again. If you want to copy this mind map, the link is in the description. Thank you very much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.